Sit. Good Lord. When you hear important music like that, you sort of get the feeling something important is about to happen. Well, it is. Look at them all. We have with us for our global economic debate, oh, you can see their names on the top. You don't need me to go through. Mark Carney, you can see his title there as well, UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. Also, of course, a minor matter. He was governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. Not that he will have any views for us today on the Bank of England's latest shenanigans. We think. The managing director of the IMF, who has been brutally honest through the World Economic Outlook, saying the worst is yet to come. Which begs the question, how much bad will it get? The Minister from Finance from Nigeria, Minister, welcome. We will be asking you, are you going to restructure your debts? Ah, wait a minute, she hasn't answered yet. And, of course, the Irish Finance Minister and President of the Eurogroup, who may or may not want a new job. He's not saying, and I doubt that he will. But if he does, he'll say it here first. And finally, of course, Mohammed Al-Arian. Well, it wouldn't be an economic debate without Mr. Al-Arian. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our panel. Managing Director. This morning we got the numbers from the United States on inflation. The reality is the worst scenario has come to pass. Inflation is now entrenched. Inflation is stubborn, but central banks can be more stubborn than it. To put it very simply, we are at the point when number one priority is to win the fight against inflation, because if we don't, that would undermine growth, and it is very bad for people, especially those on the lower end of the income spectrum. Rates are going to go higher for longer. That is what we expect to see, rates in 23, hopefully starting to trim down already next year, and getting to a point of normalization afterwards. You said, my phrase was, the worst is yet to come. Do you want me to explain why I said that? Do you want me to explain why I said that? Because rates have been going up, but they're yet to bite. They are still going up some more, and the impact of higher rates we start feeling with some lag. So we're looking towards next year. Pascal, Minister, if rates are going higher, how does the Eurogroup respond?
The Eurogroup will respond by having the right shared budgetary approach to the change in interest rates that the ECB will deem necessary. There will be a number of different elements to that. The first one is that we will have to get the scale of our budgetary intervention appropriate in our efforts to support households, investment to support businesses, and also in our efforts to move to a lower carbon and safer future.
So this means targeted relief?
It does mean targeted, but of course we're in a world where the exact design of what a targeted relief looks like is extremely hard to deliver. Because as the Managing Director and the IMF have acknowledged, we're now facing very broad economic shocks with very serious social consequences. And as finance ministers were bringing measures in difficulty, we did bring in broad measures. But what we now need to do, and the euro area is now doing this, is we need to get the level and the scale of those broad measures better calibrated in the time ahead. And then we need to ensure that new measures that are being brought in, particularly for businesses and vulnerable households, are more targeted and capped in value.
Are you expecting a recession?
We've always acknowledged that a recession is a risk. To be in front of an audience like this, in a building like this, in this institution, and to pretend otherwise simply would not be credible. However, if we look at the forecasts that we have for the euro area at the moment, for both this year and next year, they're currently pointing to a low level of growth as opposed to a recession. Now, of course, we acknowledge that could change, but it leads back to the first question you put to me then, which is having a level of budgetary policy in place that's integrated with monetary policy and we can make a difference to supporting income and in particular employment, which is still at a record level within the euro area.
Mohammed Al-Arian, there is a new language here that you're all using in some shape or form, which is that monetary and fiscal policy must be, to quote the MD this morning, cohesive, that it must work in tandem, that it must not be in opposition. In other words, it must not be the UK. Do you agree?
So I agree that monetary and fiscal policy need to work together, not just at the domestic level, but also globally. That we have a situation now where each country is self-insuring against bad outcomes, and the overall result is suboptimal. But there's a big issue here, is that unfortunately, policymakers have amplified volatility rather than manage the volatility. We've seen this in the UK. The last bout of volatility is all from the policymakers. And that is serious because we're not going through just one transition that we've talked about so far, which is the central bank transition. We're going through a different characterization of the global economy, from insufficient aggregate demand to insufficient aggregate supply, and a different way of market functioning. So policy making cannot amplify these challenges, but has to facilitate them.
Can I just pick up on what Mohammed just said, which is very important to have the right narrative about why we're having these more persistent inflationary pressures. And it starts with a series of supply shocks, some of which are very short-term, COVID-related, others are which are more fundamental. The relative prioritization, again, something you mentioned, of resilience over efficiency. That's a series of insurance payments for health, for defense, resilience within financial institutions, resilience within supply chains, which adds costs. And all of those lead to more persistent inflationary pressures, which is one of the reasons why it's higher for longer, as your words. I would make maybe perhaps a little more emphasis on the longer and the duration of a level of rates as opposed to a specific peak.
Stay with you for the second, and then we'll come to the Nigerian minister. On this question of the UK, recognising that you're a former head of the governor of the Bank of England, I saw your comments about how it puts institutional risk, or how it weakens the institutions involved. But at the end of the day, this was a policy. Do you say this was a policy error?
Well, I think there's a few quick lessons from the UK experience.
Don't do it.
Well, the first is that all of us are operating in a different risk environment, and mistakes will be punished. And that's true for any country. So that's first thing. The second is, yes, in that environment, institutions matter. The transparency, the guidelines, the restrictions that come with institutions help guide both monetary and fiscal policy, so they matter. Thirdly, the numbers need to add up, and that goes back to the second point and the first point. And then the next point is that because we're in a world where we've had a series of supply hits and we'll have more, you need a cohesive growth strategy. A growth strategy has to be comprehensive, and not just because I'm in the presence of the managing director in this group, it has to be inclusive. Look, we've been through the financial crisis. We went through COVID. We're going through a series of shocks. Now inflation. All of these shocks hit the least well off the hardest, and so a credible growth strategy is an inclusive growth strategy. It's not just an issue of fairness, it's actually an issue of credibility.
Right, we'll come back to the UK in a moment. I want to turn to Nigeria and the Honourable Minister. Minister, just listening to what the former governor was saying, that decisions, that the markets, the financial world will
punish.
Will punish. Thank you, your words. Is Nigeria about to be punished for its high debt level, do you think, that will require you to restructure it?
Well, we're actually feeling the pressures. The market cost is too high for us, so we cannot even explore the markets in the near future. And also because inflation is going up and is going to stay up for longer, our debt service obligations in foreign currency are increasing. And what we decided to do is not to wait for it to happen. We have to start looking at how do we better manage our liabilities. For example, our domestic liabilities, we've been able to shift our loans from short tenors to medium and longer term tenors. We have to do the same thing for our international borrowings as well, bilateral loans and even some of the concessional loans, that the periods could be stretched, should be stretched to give us more fiscal room. While we are working to increase revenue, to improve on our revenue to debt service, we still need to be able to renegotiate and stretch out our repayment obligations to provide us with fiscal room. So we are not restructuring our loans, but we're looking at options of how we can stretch out, including buying back some of our bonds when the market allows us to do that.
With respect, Minister, isn't that just playing with language? If you're doing all those things with existing loans, you are de facto restructuring.
But we're doing it ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're doing it to give us more fiscal room.
The ministers, if I may, minister's absolutely right. The market, what Nigeria is doing is saying the market has taken too pessimistic a view, and there's an opportunity which creates room for the people of Nigeria by doing the steps that you're taking.
And actually, this is exactly what we are recommending to countries. When you see dark clouds on the debt horizon, don't wait. Look at ways in which you can extend maturities. You can improve the matching of currency obligations with what you are earning yourself. In that sense, what Nigeria is doing in the current environment is exactly what Nigeria should be doing.
Right, but Minister, it's going to get worse because, as you've already heard and as you know, rates are going higher. They're going to stay higher for longer, which will not only create an increase in your debt servicing, but also will suck investment out from poorer countries.
It is true, and that's why we have to be ready. And that's why even if it means retiring some of the debts that are nearing maturity, we will do that to reduce the fiscal burden. We just can't stand still when we see the risks coming upon us.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk. Sorry, did you want to come in on that?
Oh, look, one very dire reality is that what is happening in terms of rates, currency appreciation, dollar appreciation, and capital flows is hitting emerging markets and developing countries hard. And this is where we see lessons from experience. Number one, build strong fundamentals.
Bit late to do that now.
No, those who have done it, it is like with the pandemic.
Right, but if you haven't done it already, it's a bit late.
Well, there would be another crisis to come. Build strong fundamentals. We are in a more shock-prone world. And two, don't be shy to face and admit reality. Part of it is recognize that when growth goes down and interest rates go up, there is an institution built to be counter-cyclical, and it is called International Monetary Fund. We are here for our members.
Let me just add to say that Nigeria consistently tracks its borrowing, and we have been able to consistently meet our debt service obligations. We will have full plans 2022, 2023, 2024 to do that. We keep doing these things on a continuous basis, monitoring our obligations. Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to add the complexity of what developing countries are facing is a multiple of just the linear combination of these things. It is not just higher for longer, HL. To draw from the NFL here, football here, okay, it's HLF is higher for longer and faster. We're getting there much faster. So there is no time to adjust. It's happening very quickly. And when it happens very quickly, it's not just the price of credit that's impacted, it's access to credit that's impacted. You saw this again in the UK. What happened to the mortgage market in the UK? A quarter of the products were taken off the marketplace. So when you have faster, in addition to higher and longer, it makes the challenge facing the more fragile economies particularly difficult.
So how bad is it going to get in your view?
I worry. I seriously worry. I think that we have limited policy space at the domestic level. If you make a mistake, and the UK did make a mistake, the reaction is such that it's very difficult to go back to where you started from. So it's a multiple equilibria where things get worse. And we don't have, unfortunately, until now, and I hope that these meetings change this, the amount of global policy coordination that we would require when there's a common problem.
So let's talk on that global policy coordination. The governor of the Bank of France, in a speech yesterday at Columbia, basically talked about the need for greater coordination, intervention, whatever one might say. When I questioned him this morning, he sort of said he was not referring to currency, coordinated currency intervention. Do you think that there needs to be some, I'm not saying we need another plaza, those of us who are old enough to remember, I'm not saying we need another plaza, but I am saying, does there need to be greater coordination to maintain strengthened currencies?
To be absolutely clear, there will not be a new Plaza Accord or whatever version of that is in place. The world has moved on from that. What is necessary is a comprehensive understanding of the spillovers of policy on each other, both in financial markets and the aggregate monetary tightening that has taken place. In addition, coordination and cooperation on the real side of the economy in terms of trade and nearshoring we can talk about. And absolutely, I want to make a marker here, around climate policy and the one area that can drive positive spillovers across. Now, we'll come back to that, I know, but we have to, and this is an issue. You chastised, I think is the right word, the managing director in her own house about saying get ready and prepare and do things today. And this is the ultimate area where we can do things today and move forward and actually drive growth along.
Yeah, I think the governor of the Bank of France, though, was also referring to the coordination opportunities that are still there within blocks such as the euro area, and there are so many. I mean, we've had much discussion here about the need to coordinate where we are between fiscal and monetary policy. But within the euro area, and the great project the European Union is still working on, is the greater efforts that we have to coordinate energy policy. And if I look at the progress that we have made in 2022, for example, a shared approach to trying to reduce consumption of energy, the work that has been done to build up common gas reserves, it is how we can build on that work throughout this year and in 2023 that is the further needed coordination opportunity for the European Union that in turn will make our task of coordinating other economic policies a little bit easier. And I have to say, I don't accept the argument as well that it's ever too late not to build up fundamentals. I don't accept that. Even in a crisis situation, even when we're facing great challenges, which we are, how we respond back to them and how we can frame a common response.
I didn't say it was never a good thing to do. I just simply said it was too late. If you're hoping, that your fundamentals are strong enough now, you had 2 or 3 years when the previous MDs said, fix the roof while before
just to deal with that in the European setting, and just to make that point before we go on.
We are totally ganging on your region.
If you look at where we are within the European setting, look at the work that has been done. Look at something like the Recovery Fund. Look at the work that has happened in dealing with COVID. Look at instruments like Next Generation EU, repower EU. You know, just the fact that this work is still relatively recent, and some of it's only a year old, some of it's still only in the process of being rolled out, is the kind of fundamentals that great efforts have been made to strengthen in just even over just the last number of months and years.
Richard, Christine Lagarde said, when the sun is shining, fix the roof. We know as human beings that the probability of fixing the roof when the sun is shining is not that high. But when it is raining, what do? We fix the roof. I'm more optimistic than you are. First, I do believe that we have done really a tremendous job in putting a floor under the world economy in 2020, 2021, during COVID. What is different today is that the task for policymakers is much harder. In 2020, we had to make so that businesses function and people function with the economy in a standstill. What do policymakers do? Monetary policy easing, fiscal policy easing. Now, monetary policy is tightening. Fiscal policy still has to support the most vulnerable people with very little space. In other words, we are in this building, we are at these meetings, we are wrestling with a tougher problem, but wrestle we must, and we would come up with better understanding what we can do. So tell people here, it is tough, but we can deal with these difficulties.
Do you think enough politicians?
Yes.
Lost the room.
And Richard, the audience is
Yeah,
with
members
us. We are ganging on you.
Your staff.
And, are you guys my staff? Are you my staff? All of you that are doing this? No.
Go, Mark.
I'll make 2 points just to pile on. Look, one of the issues about not having one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake in terms of monetary and fiscal policy.
Oh, we're back to the UK.
Yeah. Well, we're back. No, we're back to everybody. Part of that leans in the same direction of what the managing director was just saying in terms of building fiscal resilience. Second point, area for coordination and cooperation. Around financial market functioning. You know, there are real issues in treasury markets around the world that have just begun. We've seen a more extreme case, obviously, in the UK with spillovers. Mohammed's talked about this. And we are headed into a period where there will be quite additional, government bonds put on the market by quantitative tightening. And that needs to, that is a financial stability issue alongside a monetary policy issue. There needs to be coordination there amongst the authorities. There needs to be thought about microprudential instruments, I just said a lot, that could potentially be adjusted for macroprudential reasons, such as the leverage ratio on banks, to help ease this transition that's necessary from a monetary perspective, but has real market functioning issues, and we should be thinking about that right now.
If I may, still talking about coordination, I do think while we're talking about more coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities, but there also has to be more coordination within blocks, within regions. For example, in Africa, we have the opportunity of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We need to strengthen our partnership so that trade grows within our region, because what it is now is countries are acting more like protecting their territory rather than reaching out and trading.
What's the single biggest obstacle? Because as long as I can remember, in any different area, I've been hearing about people, there needs to be greater, particularly Africa, greater trade cooperation and fair trade. What's the biggest single obstacle?
Well, the biggest obstacle is every country wants to protect its businesses.
So how do you prevent, how do you solve it?
Whereas it is in reaching out, in opening up, that we actually have the opportunity. Otherwise, we're still individual markets, whereas Africa is a large market. that compete with other markets in the world. So coordination has to be also strengthened within blocks to be able to take the best advantage. We can improve our fiscals by increasing our trade.
Minister, the measures taken by the ECB to protect, or at least to strengthen, the southern European countries' bonds in the event of a crisis, another debt crisis as such, are you sure that they're sufficient, or will there need to be more?
I'm very confident about the ability of the euro area and the euro to be absolutely resilient in any of the circumstances that we're discussing. And it's not just because of the work that the ECB has done, it's also because of how we have strengthened all of the other pillars of the euro. If you look at where we are now versus where we were in the global financial crisis, the regulation of the banks, of our financial sector, is so much stronger. If you look at the average deficit within the euro area, it is at a level that is higher than it was pre-COVID, but it's still far lower than many would have expected. And if I look at things such as the deployment of the recovery fund from COVID, a common economic tool, funded via common debt, unthinkable a decade ago, now happening. And it does lead me back to concurring with a point that the managing director has made that led to more than just her staff applauding her for. I think there's a really big difference between acknowledging uncertainty and fear and being overwhelmed by it. There's a very big difference, because the message that is coming out of these really important meetings, and incidentally, it's great to be here again, it's great to be here in person and see everybody again, is a very nuanced and clear policy direction regarding what we can do to mitigate these risks and to try to navigate our way through them. And whether it be coordination, whether it's what we need to do from an energy point of view, or it's about the need to be more conscious to our responsibilities to developing economies, the messages are being given here regarding what we need to do. So acknowledging these risks is not the same thing as saying we are powerless in front of them, and we will act to manage them.
And if we act together,
Yes.
we can win.
Absolutely.
If countries or regional blocs work alone without working with everybody else, strengthening our partnership, then the likelihood of winning is reduced. But if we act together, we can actually overcome.
I don't know why you're so, I don't know why, and we'll come to climate. I don't know why you're so optimistic on this point about acting together. COVID showed us that everybody will talk a good talk and not do anything about it. Africa's vaccination rate is still low because vaccines, where the developed world has got more vaccine than it knows what to do with, could vax everybody several times over.
But what happened is Africa came together, being able to, as a bloc, acquire their own vaccines, being able now, as a bloc, begin to set up manufacturing facilities. So it's a positive outcome at the end of the day.
So why can't they do it with trade?
We are already working under the FCFTA to conquer that as well.
I want to turn to climate.
Richard, can I go back a minute? Because I think what the minister said is really important. I completely share your optimism that this is not 2012. We're not going to worry about the fragmentation of the Eurozone. I don't know whether Mark would agree with me, I share the optimism that the banking system in most countries is robust and will be able to navigate this. However, that is not where the issues are. So go back to your house. While we are fixing the roof in the middle of a storm, water is coming through. And the water is impacting two things that we should worry about. One is growth models. We have relied on finance-dependent growth models. That is no longer feasible, and we don't have good alternative growth models. Issue number two is the electric system is not the banks, it's the non-banks, where unfortunately supervision and regulation has lagged the banks. So who would have thought that the UK pension system would be a source of systemic risk? But it is, because there's been massive risk-taking in the non-banks during a time of zero interest rates and abundant liquidity. So I share the optimism on the old problems, but I worry about some other problems.
But that is, Mohammed, you and I very often agree 100%. So this time we agree 90%. Because Of course, there are new problems that come, and we have to solve these problems. After the global financial crisis, we did put the banking sector in order, and we left the non-banking financial institutions, which at that time were only 10%, to meander in the wilderness. And as you said, they gobbled up far too much risk, and they have increased in size. To me, what this says is, here is a problem we have to solve. And I think it becomes much more visible today, and the probability of solving it is much higher. Actually, that was a topic of discussion at the G20 exactly for that reason. So my plea for all of us is to identify rationally problems and then muster the will to solve them, because
Which is more difficult?
to identify the problem or to muster the will?
Muster
the will. Muster the will. This is the more difficult problem.
Manager Director, I would just add one more thing and protect the most vulnerable segments of society
Absolutely.
because they are exposed to the collateral damage of acting.
This is the 100%, Mohammed. 100% agree.
I want to turn on this, muster the will, because let's talk about climate for a few minutes, because I can hear the answer, it's not an either or at the moment. You've still got to do climate relief, you've still got to do energy transition, et cetera, but does it have to take a back seat to what we're dealing with, particularly, of course, bearing in mind Ukraine and the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think the short answer is no, absolutely not. And I think the evidence is increasingly in on the decisions that governments are taking. Let me put a fine point on it, which is, what do we learn from the war in Ukraine? We have an energy system that's unreliable. By the way, it's been around for a century, this energy system. It's unreliable, it's unaffordable, it's inaccessible, and it's unsustainable. Those are four realities of it. Secondly, what do you have to do in the short term to keep the lights on, to keep, countries will do what they have to do, understandably, in the short term to keep their people warm, to keep the lights on. But the big decisions around energy systems do not affect those energy systems for 5 years at least. And if you look at what the EU has done with Repower EU, quintupling by the end of this decade the rate of clean power that's going to come into place, backed up by things like one-year permitting and other incentives. If you look at the scale of incentives, I think this is still massively underappreciated, the scale of incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And actually what's starting to happen is countries are looking at that, other countries looking at it and saying, I think we better match it, okay? So the jury in terms of the movement on energy systems is to an absolute acceleration of clean energy. The reality, though, the downside is that in the short term, we're using up more of the carbon budget, and therefore we have to go faster.
But does that downside extend? Because once you've started the argument of sort of, we're going to need that coal power station, we're going to need to dig more coal, we're going to need to open up new gas fields, does it then just become a natural progression, even, please God, the war ends?
No, I honestly don't think so. I think that countries are looking at where they're going to be, as I say, in 5 years, including, and helped by the IMF, including in the emerging and developing world, about really building, I'll give a commercial for you, on the Resilience Trust. And are we using precious public resources, I'll stop with this, precious public resources, to leverage in private capital, and there is a wall of private capital that is looking for exactly these type of investment opportunities.
Mohammed made the point there that what this current challenge is doing is posing the question regarding the sufficiency of our growth models and what are the alternative growth models that we need to develop at this moment of difficulty. And some of the key strands of it were just identified by Mark, and I agree with his optimism regarding where we are. He is right to say that in the short term, governments are doing what they need to do to keep the energy, to look after our countries at a moment of real security challenge. But if I look at where we are within the European Union, climate for finance ministers is now discussed every month when we meet. And the tone of those discussions pre-war was about how we respond back to that awful political challenge of a medium, long-term risk of chaos that happens incrementally. And instead now, that has been transformed by the context of a war. So a security dimension has now been added onto us that has transformed it completely. And as a finance minister community within the European Union, we're also clear that not only is part of the answer to the need for a new growth model, how we supercharge where we are with renewables, but it's also part of the security model for Europe for decades ahead. And if I look at the priorities that governments have, investment in lower carbon technologies, investment in renewables, hasn't been altered at all by the effect of the war. In fact, the commitment to it has deepened.
I want to go back, I want to go back to inflation. Oh, for as long as I can remember, I've been...
Richard, if I may,
of course.
on energy, on the climate change.
Of course, Minister.
What has happened with the war in Ukraine for us in Africa is we are ending up now seeing countries going back more to fossil fuel because they don't have an option. And it becomes easier for us to push for the transition that we've been asking for, at least for energy sources like gas, to be allowed to stay with us. So for us, in a way, that has brought us some advantage because we know there is now an agreement that more gas needs to be produced in other places other than where Ukraine and Russia. So in a way, for African countries that have gas to produce, it's a positive thing. We just hope that the bank and the fund will meet their commitments to support us in accessing finance to develop gas.
Right, but that's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or the other way around.
Yeah, but that's what we.
I mean, that's the reality that.
Actually, it is 1 step backward. I'm convinced we are dancing the tango the right way. 1 step backward, 2 steps forward. I know that what we would witness is acceleration of the green transition. Why? Because the same way during the pandemic, we recognized that vaccine policy was economic policy, we now recognize that energy policy, energy security is economic policy. And with the price of fossil fuels up, the competitive force of alternatives is clearly demonstrable. It takes some time, so we have to do more of the investments you're talking about. And it takes using public money to remove barriers for private finance on scale. Mark said something very interesting. In a couple of years ago, when we were talking about climate change being macro-critical, there were skeptics. Yeah. Richard, look at the corner over there at the IMF. What does it say? Climate matters. Yeah. In short 2 years, we have transformed the mindset of macro policy to integrate climate, and we would reap off the benefits of it.
2 points. It's not 1 step back, 2 steps forward. It's 4 steps forward. That is the scale of the acceleration of clean energy in Europe, in the US, in the UK, in Canada, that's happened in the course of the last 6 months. I think it's massively underappreciated. Second point, so you can get back to inflation, I know you want to go there, which is to reinforce what the managing director just said. Climate policy is macro policy. It is the 3rd pillar of macro policy. It influences the path of inflation. Great work by the IMF and the WEO on this exact issue, and it will absolutely influence the path of growth in a positive way. It's one of the big growth multipliers for medium term. Over to you.
A new growth trajectory for Mohammed.
I've decided to leave inflation. I want to finish on this idea. It's inflation related. All right, it's inflation. We were told for so long the significance of 2%. We were told that policymakers knew what they were doing. We were told that X, Y, Z. So Mohammed El-Arian, how the hell do we end up with inflation 3, 4, 5 times the rate?
I thought you were going to ask me whether 2% is still the right number.
That's a different way of saying the same question. Is it?
I think if you were designing today what the right inflation number is, it would be above 2%. There are significant resource reallocations going on in the global economy, and you need a bit more lubrication of that. However, you're stuck with 2%.
But if I failed as spectacularly as central banks have failed to get that to keep the 2%, not even close, not even close. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, I think you're unusually not giving recognition for the scale of unpredictable events that we got buffeted by. I mean, the central bank community, budget policy, finance ministers have dealt with a pandemic. They've dealt with the effect of a war on the global economic system. And I think if you were looking at policymakers in calmer times, in the absence of low-frequency, high-impact events, I think your critique might have a bit more edge to it. But if I look at where we are at the moment, whether you're a central bank governor or whether you're a finance minister, we're dealing with a pandemic that some predicted, but not many saw happening in the way it did. And we're now dealing with a huge war of scale in Europe. I'm not here making excuses, because of course where we are is an environment of new and real challenges. But I would make the case that perhaps more preparation did happen than you're acknowledging, the value of which we are seeing now, and the scale of collective response to these challenges, either during COVID or during the war, again, has more meaning and impact than I think is sometimes acknowledged.
If I'll answer your what happened question this way. If we were in this room, the last time we were in this room and for the decade before that, much of the discussion would effectively be about interest rates being at rock bottom, inflation being below target, deficient demand. How do we get demand up? But there'd be some talk of structural. Anyways, it's a world of deficient demand. We shifted over COVID to a world of a series of supply shocks, specifically with COVID, then with the energy shock, the changing nature of globalization, the climate transition, all of those are supply shocks. It is an absolutely different environment, which is part of the reason why it's there. I'll add two other points. One is that of course is also what was happening with Brexit. And we did identify with Brexit in advance that would be a negative supply shock, would drive the exchange rate down, inflation up, and would potentially force the central bank to raise interest rates into a recession. That is what's happening in aggregate to the global economy now. And it is a huge regime shift, and the need is to balance policy to bring it back. And I think that's underestimated. This is not a little cyclical adjustment.
Yeah, what we are witnessing is a transition from a world of more predictability, where interest rates were low and inflation was low, to a world of more frequent exogenous shocks, shock upon shock upon shock. We have to really work out on changing our mindset to be much more precautionary and to be prepared for much more uncertainty we deal with. Think of the unthinkable.
I want to end on a positive note. So, Minister, start with you, Minister. One reason why I should be optimistic.
Well, let me use my country, Nigeria, as an example.
We don't have too long.
Oh, okay. Well, we should all be optimistic because despite the several shocks that we've been going through, we've been able to have a stable economy, be able to report growth, and be able to provide support to the vulnerable people. And this is a plan that we have for on a medium-term basis.
Mr. President, one reason why we should be optimistic, and start your answer with whether you want to be head of the ESM.
So I've got a number of jobs that I'm doing at the moment that I want to keep on doing for as long as I can, as long as my government allows me to do it, and I'm spending all my time trying to get another good candidate for the ESM, which we will do. It's not me, I'm overseeing the process. But I think in making the case for optimism, we need, frankly, as important as the ESM is and who's running us, I think we've broader grounds for optimism in the time ahead. And Two reasons I would offer very briefly for optimism is, number one, I think despite the terror, the darkness that is holding in many parts of the world, there are still many reasons to be reassured and have confidence in the ingenuity and goodness of people to make a difference. And secondly, if I look at Europe, Europe is forged in moments of crisis. We did it during COVID, we're going to do it again during this war, and we will, I'm confident, navigate our way through these moments to get to a better place.
You're always optimistic.
I'm always optimistic. We have a way to add 25 percentage points to the level of global GDP over the course of the next 3 decades, which is to make good on the commitments that we all made in Glasgow. The fund is helping line us up for that. It's a near-term growth engine, and it pays dividends in terms of cleaning the environment.
Should we be optimistic?
We should be, in the sense that we are on a bumpy journey to a better destination. You've heard the elements of the better destination, which is more sustainable, more inclusive growth. We also are exiting a very artificial regime that we got stuck in for too long. So that's another element of optimism. We should recognize that that journey is going to be incredibly bumpy. And I look to colleagues, I spent 15 years in this amazing institution. They're going to have to lead in playing both defense and offense. Defense for navigating the journey, and offense to be well prepared for the destination.
Managing Director, you get the last word of optimism.
And I'm notoriously an optimist. I'm optimistic because we people are incredibly creative, resilient, and able to overcome. And what is even more important, we love being with each other. So I think we get energy from the fact that we have our families, our friends, and that gives us tremendous strength. And I want to finish with a big round of applause for the fact that after 3 years of COVID, we are back in this place and we are together.
Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you.